The explosion was visible from Beer Sheva, not a flash, not a distant rumble that you might attribute to something else. Visible. A column of smoke rose above the Negev this morning to an altitude that satellite imaging systems tracked in real time, and the Israeli government, which had the damage assessment within minutes of impact, has issued exactly 0 words about what just happened to the most sensitive nuclear facility in the Middle East. This was not the Fatah 3. It was not the Shahab variant that has been the workhorse of Iran's missile campaign against Israel's major cities. What Iran fired at Dimona this morning was the Khorramshahr 4, the weapon Iran calls the Khaybar, the heaviest, most capable, most specifically dangerous ballistic missile in Iran's operational inventory, and it was not the first missile to hit Dimona, it was the third. Each of the previous 2 produced silence. This one has produced a silence of a categorically different quality, because this explosion cannot be managed within the concealment framework that held for the first 2. And the communities living within the potential dispersal radius of whatever the Khorramshahr 4 just reached underground are breathing the air above the Negev right now without a single word of guidance from the government that knows what that air may contain. The Khorramshahr 4 does not appear in casual discussions of Iranian missile capability because most discussions of Iranian missiles focus on what Iran fires most often, not what Iran was specifically developing for the hardest targets. Iran publicly unveiled the Khorramshahr 4, in which it designated the Khaybar missile, in 2023. It is a medium-range ballistic missile with a range of approximately 2,000 kilometers and a warhead payload that places it at the top of Iran's operational arsenal by mass. For context, the Fatah 3 that Iran used in earlier waves of this conflict carries a warhead estimated between 1,000 and 1,500 kilograms. The Khorramshahr 4 operates at the upper end of that range, and depending on the specific configuration used, potentially beyond it, but warhead mass alone does not explain why the Khorramshahr 4 represents a categorical escalation from every other weapon Iran has fired at Dimona. The defining characteristic of the Khorramshahr 4 is not its size, it is what it was built to do with that size. The missile was specifically designed and tested against hardened underground infrastructure. The test footage Iran released showed the warhead being evaluated against reinforced concrete structures of the type used in hardened military and nuclear facility construction. The penetration capability, the missile's ability to drive through reinforced concrete and detonate below the surface rather than at it, is the specific engineering characteristic that distinguishes the Khorramshahr 4 from the weapons used in the first 2 Dimona strikes and from everything else Iran has fired in this conflict. Iran did not choose this missile because it had nothing else available. It chose this missile because no other missile in its inventory was designed for the specific task that the 3rd Dimona strike required. The smoke column visible from Beer Sheva is not incidental detail, it is evidence. A surface detonation of a conventional warhead against reinforced perimeter infrastructure produces a specific explosion profile, a horizontal blast radius, a surface crater, and a smoke signature that spreads outward from the impact point at ground level. That is not what was observed above Dimona this morning. What was observed was a column. Material ejected upward from a penetration point, a ground shock that propagated through the surrounding geology, felt in Dimona city, felt in Arad, felt as far as the communities of the northern Negev that have been living under this conflict's missile campaign for weeks. When a penetrating warhead drives through reinforced concrete and detonates below the surface, it does not produce a horizontal blast. It produces an upward ejection column whose height and composition depend on what the warhead reached when it detonated. If the penetration point intersects with a cavity, an underground chamber, a tunnel, a reprocessing space, the explosion is not merely the warhead, it is the warhead plus whatever pressure and material was contained in the space the warhead reached. The smoke column that satellite systems tracked above Dimona this morning was not the signature of a missile striking perimeter concrete. It was the signature of something that went in before it went off. And the altitude that column reached tells you that what was below the surface at the penetration point was not empty, reinforced concrete. To understand what the Khorramshahr 4 represents in the context of this morning's strike, you need to understand that this was not the 3rd random attack on the same facility. It was the 3rd phase of a deliberate, sequenced campaign against a specific target architecture. The first strike on Dimona, which the Israeli military acknowledged hitting the towns of Dimona and Arad and injuring at least 180 people, compromised surface infrastructure and perimeter structures. Iran's IRGC issued statements at the time declaring that Dimona was a primary target following Israeli strikes on Natanz. That first strike degraded the redundancy of the protective barriers between the facility's nuclear materials and the outside environment. It reduced the structural integrity of the perimeter architecture that subsequent strikes would need to penetrate further. The second strike arrived against a facility already operating with reduced protective integrity from the first. It was not attacking an intact, fully defended installation. It was continuing the degradation process on an installation whose outermost defensive architecture had already been compromised. The Bloomberg analysis of Iran's harder-to-hunt long-range missiles specifically noted that targets near Dimona most likely involved Khorramshahr variants. Missiles with among the longest ranges and heaviest payloads in Iran's arsenal, selected precisely because the target required them. The third strike, this morning's Khorramshahr 4, was the penetrating warhead phase, the phase that the first two strikes were designed to make possible. Surface and perimeter infrastructure first, structural integrity degradation second, underground penetration third. That sequence is not improvisation. It is a three-phase engineering campaign against a specific target architecture that required each phase to degrade the facility's resistance before the next phase could achieve maximum effect. Iran knew the protective architecture Dimona uses. It knew that a penetrating warhead against a twice-damaged facility would reach underground components that the same warhead against an intact facility might not, and it waited. The Israeli government has maintained official ambiguity about the Dimona facility's contents for decades, but the analytical community's understanding of the facility's underground components, built from decades of satellite imaging, defector accounts, and technical analysis, provides the framework for assessing what the Khorramshahr 4's underground detonation may have reached. The underground components of the Dimona facility are believed to include the reprocessing plant where weapons-grade plutonium is separated from reactor fuel. They are believed to include storage areas for weapons-grade fissile materials, and they are believed to potentially include areas associated with weapons assembly or storage infrastructure. A penetrating warhead detonation in proximity to those components does not produce uniform consequences, regardless of which component it reaches. A detonation near a reprocessing plant that is not actively operating produces different radiological consequences from a detonation near stored weapons-grade material. A detonation near fissile material storage produces different consequences depending on the configuration and containment status of the material at the time of impact. The Israeli government knows which underground component the Khorramshahr 4 reached. It knows the detonation depth and the blast radius relative to each component. It knows the current structural and containment status of each component following the detonation, and it is saying none of that. The IAEA, which had previously stated it detected no abnormal radiation levels following earlier strikes near Dimona, has now issued a second statement following this morning's third strike requesting immediate access to the facility, this time describing the situation as a matter of international nuclear safety concern. Israel has not responded. There is a specific distinction between the silence that followed the first two Dimona strikes and the silence that is following this third one, and that distinction is the most alarming dimension of this morning's events. The silence following the first two strikes was the silence of a government managing an information problem. It had inconvenient information and chose to withhold it. That is a political calculation, however troubling its consequences. The silence following this morning's Khorramshahr 4 strike may be something different. A penetrating warhead detonation in an underground nuclear facility complex is not an event whose full consequences are known in the first hour. Ground shock propagates through surrounding geology over time. The structural response of hardened underground chambers to a nearby detonation unfolds over hours, not minutes. The radiological consequences of any damage to underground containment depend on processes that develop on a timeline measured in hours to days. It is possible, and this is the possibility that makes this morning's silence categorically more alarming than anything that preceded it, that the Israeli government is silent in part because it does not yet have a complete picture of what the Khorramshahr 4's underground detonation has done. A government that is still waiting for its own assessment of what Iran's most powerful missile did to its own nuclear infrastructure is not a government managing the situation. It is a government inside a situation that has exceeded the parameters of any scenario it prepared for. And the hundreds of thousands of people living around that facility cannot wait for the assessment to be completed before making decisions about their safety. They are breathing the air that exists right now. The assessment's completion will not retroactively clean whatever is in that air. The abstraction of nuclear facility damage needs to be translated into the human geography it threatens. Beer Sheva has a population of approximately 210,000 people. Arad, which absorbed direct missile strikes in the first Dimona wave, has a population of approximately 26,000. Dimona city itself, which sits closest to the nuclear research center, has a population of approximately 33,000. The communities of the northern Negev that sit within the potential dispersal radius of whatever was released from the Dimona facility by this morning's penetrating detonation collectively house hundreds of thousands of Israeli civilians. None of them have been told to evacuate. None of them have been told to seal their windows and doors. None of them have been issued guidance that reflects the specific risk profile of living within range of a nuclear facility that has absorbed 3 ballistic missile strikes, the third of which used a penetrating warhead specifically engineered for underground infrastructure. The guidance they have received is the same shelter guidance the entire country has been operating under throughout this conflict. Go to the shelter when the sirens sound. That guidance was designed for a conventional missile threat environment. It was written for a country managing ballistic missile attacks against conventional infrastructure. It was not written for the environment that exists around Dimona this morning, and the government that issued it has not revised it, supplemented it, or acknowledged in any public communication that the environment around Dimona this morning is different from the environment it was written for. There is one development from this morning's third Dimona strike that cuts through every layer of strategic analysis and lands with the specific clarity that only the starkest contrasts can produce. Jordan, a sovereign nation that shares a border with Israel but is not a party to this conflict, has issued a formal diplomatic protest about the radiological risk posed by the Dimona strikes. And beyond the diplomatic protest, Jordan has begun distributing potassium iodide tablets to communities in the areas of its territory nearest to the Israeli border. Potassium iodide distribution is not a precautionary gesture in the administrative sense. It is a radiological protective measure that governments deploy when they assess that a population faces a credible risk of radioactive iodine exposure. It is what you give people when you believe the air may carry something their thyroid glands should be protected from absorbing. Jordan has made that assessment for Jordanian citizens based on what happened at Dimona this morning. The Israeli government has made no equivalent assessment public for Israeli citizens. The communities living around Dimona, in Beer Sheva, in Arad, in Dimona City across the northern Negev, are closer to the facility than the Jordanian communities receiving potassium iodide tablets. They are more exposed, not less. And the government of the country where the nuclear facility sits is doing less to protect the health of the people living beside it than the government of a neighboring country with no formal stake in the conflict's outcome. That contrast is not a communication failure, it is a moral one. And it will not remain invisible to the Israeli public as the hours following this morning's third strike continue to pass. The international response to the third Dimona strike has arrived with more urgency and more specificity than the responses to the first two, because the first two produced silence that was manageable within the framework of ongoing monitoring, and the third has produced a smoke column visible from 2 cities, and an IAEA request that Israel has not answered. France has issued a statement calling for transparency about the radiological status of the Dimona facility following the Khorramshahr 4 strike. Germany has called for an emergency session of the UN Security Council, specifically to address the nuclear safety dimensions of this conflict. Not the military dimensions, not the strategic dimensions, the nuclear safety dimensions. The IAEA's second statement, upgrading its characterization of the situation to a matter of international nuclear safety concern, represents a significant escalation in the international nuclear watchdog's public posture toward a conflict that it had previously described as closely monitored. Israel's allies, who have been managing their domestic public opinion within the framework of Israel's right to defend itself, are now managing a different question. Not whether Israel has the right to defend itself, that question has not changed, but whether a country conducting a conflict in the vicinity of a nuclear facility that has absorbed 3 ballistic missile strikes has an obligation to the international community to provide transparency about the radiological status of that facility. The answer to that question, in every allied capital's domestic political environment, is becoming more clearly yes with each hour that Israel's silence extends. The open question that the third Dimona strike forces into the center of this conflict is not a strategic question. It is not a military question. It is not a question that can be deferred until the government's internal assessment is complete or until the political environment makes transparency more convenient. What is in the air above the Negev right now? Not as a rhetorical gesture, as a factual question that hundreds of thousands of Israeli civilians are entitled to have answered by the government that possesses the information needed to answer it. The Khorramshahr 4 detonated underground at Dimona this morning. The explosion was visible from 2 cities. The smoke column was tracked by satellite systems. Iran structured 3 sequential strikes, the first to breach the surface, the second to degrade the structure, the third to reach underground, using a missile specifically engineered to drive through reinforced concrete before detonating. And the government of the country, where that happened, is maintaining a silence that is now less protective of its own citizens than the active tablet distribution program of a neighboring country watching from across the border. The silence following the first Dimona strike was a policy choice. The silence following the second was the continuation of that choice. The silence following the third is something else. It is a government that has been outrun by events. By a 3-phase Iranian campaign, it did not intercept. By an explosion, it cannot explain away. And by a question it cannot answer without confirming what it has been working for weeks to conceal. The hundreds of thousands of Israelis breathing the air above the Negev this morning did not choose to live inside a concealment strategy. They were placed inside one by a government that chose silence over transparency at every prior opportunity. And the cost of that choice is now measured not in political inconvenience,